if we think, more broadly, sort of in the book title, we say human and national. What is the link then between, say, ethnic identity or economic insecurity or climate change, pandemic to national security? One of the things that we, again, sort of notice and feel is, that I think the bias in national security circles, establishment thinking, tends to be sort of defining sort of the most dangerous as a nuclear war with another great power. And then that sort of leads to sort of the, from an acquisition perspective, the bias towards the most expensive solution. And so, a simple question like, well, what's better than a fourth generation fighter, right? A fifth generation fighter. And so we keep having these incremental improvements in terms of how we build out our defense establishments. And then when you see, though, how defense is applied, as a tool of foreign policy, you often see sort of a mismatch. So for example, the United States and its allies and partners have been in Afghanistan now coming up on 20 years. And you look at sort of the very expensive militaries designed for conventional conflict, haven't really produced the results that people would expect, namely defeat the Taliban, let alone bring stability, which is a different sort of problem. But as we sort of started looking at, like in the question of Afghanistan, and I served there for a year, the solutions weren't really traditional military conventional solutions. It was about, the programs were about how do you improve Afghan literacy? How do you improve Afghan public health? How do you promote inclusivity and diversity? Key things to bring stability to a society, because Kathleen and I really conclude without human security, you can't have national security. And the lack of security inside Afghanistan brought together dozens of countries in an attempt to stabilize it. At the same time, it brought in groups, both domestic Taliban, or foreign, different versions of, at the time, either al-qaeda or now ISIS, attempting to sort of harness that instability for their own purposes. And so we sort of looked at, to give the COVID plug, so our bias is towards the most expensive. And so, the most expensive meant, doing the gene sequencing of COVID-19, virus in about 3 hours, and there's dozens of countries developing a vaccine. The cheap solution might be the mask. It's a highly cheap solution, but, we're all counting on the vaccine, but, in the short term, right, the mask is the other way to sort of get at it. Because there was no gene sequencing, when the references are made back to the 1918 influenza. Germ theory, I think, was very, barely an idea 100 years ago during the last great influenza pandemic, let alone gene sequencing and DNA. One of the concerns too that we had is at times our sort of traditional national security lens overshadows these human security issues. And so, if we take the case of China, the U.S. has identified China as a competitor, and the U.S. is deeply concerned about expansive Chinese claims in the maritime space, Chinese military modernization, to include deliberately developing, systems to, target the U.S., its forces, its allies in the region. So there's a lot of attention on China from a national security perspective, very little attention about public health in China. And as we sort of think about, right, the COVID-19 pandemic, hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost, millions infected, probably millions will die, trillions of dollars on the economy globally, contraction of GDP, and it's going to have lasting impact. But very little, I would say, national attention is focused on that. And that, again, is sort of one of, I think, the diagnosis we have is, at least in the United States, the national government is, thinks really external. And state governments are responsible for public health and education, and things that we would put in the human security field. But we can see sort of the limits of states having their various COVID-19 risks that we can't get a national solution because of that fragmentation. And in certain fields, maybe I'll offer sort of one more last thought, and then we can, you can interrogate my thesis here, is, this idea too of human security. The other point I always like to make is, it's very much, it's an American idea that, and I'll at least reach back to FDR's 1941 State of the Union address. And so, the US president really laying out these four freedoms, that people everywhere in the world, regardless of location, regardless of nationality, should have freedom of speech. They should have freedom of worship. They should have freedom from want, and they should have freedom from fear. And these four freedoms, I think, are really inside the DNA of US national security thinking. A longer discussion of, how that fell out, I would pull you into that discussion because you think a lot about this as well. Some of it I think is the nuclear age that we got into, right? The bias towards humanity could end in 12 minutes with a nuclear war. And so these issues were sort of deemed as lesser. I would say probably advances within developed countries in public health and in vaccinations and eliminating that and sort of that global campaign. Poverty, there obviously, in the 60s, there was sort of a concerted effort, the war on poverty, to address that. That still sort of continues both in the US and globally. And we've often sort of, fragmented, I think, these two dimensions. And as I said earlier, we would sort of default to, you can't have national security without human security.